Hello, and welcome to a British Cartographic Society Teatime Talk. My name is Chris Tributus. I'm the coordinator for the Teatime Talks and today's chair. Today's speaker is Peter Vujakovic, and his talk is on Can't See the Woodbank for the Trees, where he will discuss the use of maps as a resource in teaching geography, history, and archaeology. And so without much further delay, I'll hand you over to Peter.
What I'm going to do today is take us through some sort of general stuff about what the Education Committee of the BCS is currently doing, and then just use this case study to suggest how members might help us out. The key to it really is that it's a case study that I've been using for many years in higher education, a little exercise with first-year students about landscape and the use of maps. But I'm hoping to be able to adapt it for use in schools, even potentially to top year primary. I want to go through that in a minute. What I'm really hoping is that some of the people listening today who might not have thought of themselves as getting involved with the education side of the BCS might have something that perhaps if they're a business, they use as a case study or an exemplar to sell their product, which could actually be adapted in some way as a small teaching exercise. So I've got no expectations here at all, but we'll see. Even people perhaps ask me questions. And I certainly hope after this, people will come and chat to me, maybe other members of the Education Committee, about how they could perhaps engage and perhaps just do some small little things. It doesn't need to be too many case studies or little exemplars that we could use with schools. Okay, just very quickly, the Education Committee sort of had a bit of a revamp in the last year, but it's still tough going because so many of us are involved in other things and finding time is very difficult. We now have a core Education Committee and several subgroups. I won't go through all the writing on the screen there, but we're trying to create a flexible model which will engage more members of the BCS and others to contribute to education initiatives by a series of clear work streams. And we did come up at the beginning or the end of last year, beginning of this year, with 4 streams. One was a curricular support group, which Darren Bailey and others who work at the OS have thought about trying to work up some bespoke materials by BCS members and member organisations for schools. But that is ongoing. The web page design group, again, we're really just getting that going now, is essentially to have some hot links to other resources. So not just our own resources, but OS resources, BBC, RGS, Geographical Association, but providing some context from a cartographic angle. So again, this is where we need members perhaps to get involved. My classic example is the National Library of Scotland, which does outreach events and so on, but it has a wonderful resource with its scanned maps that just needs a few little handy hints for teachers as to how they could use it. Geography teachers, history teachers, and so on. The values group is involved in this whole thing about looking at things like decolonising the curriculum and so on, that's ongoing, but I won't say much about that. The one I'd just like to say a little bit about is the Historic Towns project, which is really quite exciting. It involves us in partnership with Canterbury Christ Church University, which is Alex Kent and myself and some others anyway. The Historic Towns Trust, which includes people like Giles Darks and Nick Milley, the Canterbury Archaeological Trust, and then the ones at the bottom are not partners, but are certainly, we have links with the Historic Association. We have an ex-president on our project. We have an ex-president of the Geographical Association, and Darren of the OS is providing advice as well. And what we're seeking to do here with this project, which has just got a small amount of funding from Canterbury Christ Church, and some match funding from a couple of the other organisations listed there, is to use the Historic Towns Trust wonderful maps like the newly created Canterbury, and it will be a Canterbury-based project, to engage with schools, particularly this idea of getting kids to understand their sense of place, their place in history, but see it as something about the future, so about sustainability, about sustainable communities and so on. So that's an exciting initiative which is really just cranking up now that we've got some funding. And the initial phase will have to be finished by the 31st of July for funding reasons. But after that, we hope perhaps to upscale it to other parts of the UK, particularly where the Historic Towns Trust has already produced some maps. Okay, so on to the case study. As I said, this is something which I've been running for a number of years as a first year exercise at higher ed, but I've also used in terms of sort of staff development type activities where you've got to get people engaged with using some sort of product, working together and so on. And it's a neat little exercise that's based on Forestry Commission and a number of other sources, which provides you with the basis for identifying potential areas of ancient woodland from maps. It can't guarantee, you still have to go into the field, you have to look at field evidence, everything from indicator species of trees and plants to other types of features like ancient wood banks and so on. So it's not definitive, but it is the first step. And of course, it makes a really interesting way into looking at maps, because quite often we don't have a purpose when we introduce students to maps. Here's a really key one that works very well for geographers, landscape historians, archaeologists and others. So identifying potential ancient woodlands from map evidence. And of course, you've got a nice little example there of the old provisional series. It's the one I'll use, because we have a collection at Christchurch, so we can scan them and they are out of copyright. But actually, they're very beautiful. I think I prefer them almost to any other series for looking at particularly things like physical features and rivers and water bodies. They show up really well. It's a very beautiful series. People can argue with me about that if they like. Just quickly to set it in context, one of the team that's working with us, and she's on the BCS Education Committee, is Paula Owens. She's works with the Geographic Association. She works for the OS, and she's actually created the key documents for the Ordnance Survey on early years and primary schools and mapping. And this particular document produced for Dina, working with the OS on Digimap, is a sort of progression mapping exercise. And here, one of the things that's important to me is, and to everyone else, is that we must stick to the curriculum. So if we're offering resources and exercises for schools and so on, we must stick to the curriculum, and we must be providing something that's actually needed by teachers and their students. And if we look here in terms of years 5 and 6, which are the top end primary, here are some of the key things that have been identified. I can, speaking in the child's voice, relate maps to each other and to vertical aerial photographs. So there's a key thing. So this idea that they should be able to work from OS maps to air photographs. Can use 4 and 6 figure Ordnance Survey other grid references to locate features. So another key skill there. It's interesting because I've also been told that many school teachers, you've got excellent school teachers, but their background is not in geography. So some of them may not even know how to do that themselves, let alone teach their children. So there are some challenges in working with schools. Under perspective and scale, I can use maps to talk about contours and slope, and that comes into what I'll be talking about in a minute. And then I can use maps to research factual information about locations and features. And what's come out very clearly from Ofsted reports is that there is a need to support teachers in terms of map work and field work. This is one area that a lot of primary schools are struggling with. So, the launch from the map into field work, so finding out about locations and then perhaps even going out and observing. So good observation, data collection in the field is something which this particular exercise would support. So what sort of things are we looking at here? Ancient woodland, again, I might be teaching grandma to suck eggs. There are probably a lot of people here who know some of this stuff. But ancient woodland in Britain is any area of woodland that's been continuously because it's a continuously present at least. That sounds wrong, I can't show, but it has to have been in place since 1600 AD. That doesn't sound that ancient, but of course, if you look at any of the evidence, a lot of woods that are now in the landscape, they may have been nibbled away at, but do go back to medieval times. You can read Oliver Rackham, who's the expert on that sort of area, his history of the British countryside. So semi-natural ancient woodland is the one we're really interested in. This is woodland with native species with no obvious planting. So it's had native species that have been managed, certainly managed, coppiced, pollarded, whatever it might be, for many, many centuries even, but it's still there. There's also this thing called continuous since 1600, but with former cover removed and other trees planted. In the Blean near Canterbury, we're looking at mainly Kent examples here, we've had areas stripped of chestnut coppice, other types of woodland, and replanted with pines. So this is replanted ancient woodland. It's still woodland but it's generally of less conservation value. So what we're really interested in are the semi-natural ancient woodlands. Nice little example there of Fish Ponds Wood as a nice name in the landscape there in Kent. So what sort of things are we doing? I could see perhaps how even using the mapping tool that Paula created for years 5 and 6, they probably should be able to cope with using maps to look for this sort of evidence. So I've yet to test this. So I know it works very well with undergraduates. I know it works well with diverse adult groups. It should work very well with secondary, but it needs field testing. And that's one thing that we need to look at in the next year. This is an example of some of the work we'll do with primary schools. I think it should work, having worked with primary schools in other ways. So what sort of things are we looking for? Name evidence on maps. Names associated with traditional woodland management, so coppicing. So you'll see copse or coppice in names. Other types of name evidence associated with non-woodland management, e.g. the warren or ox pasture, which tends to suggest that it's relatively new woodland. It might still be pretty old with an oldish name, but it makes you start to have to think about whether you will label this as ancient woodland or not. But again, the field evidence will be the thing that's needed then. So we have some variation from that perspective. And then much more important here tends to be associated with the name of a nearby parish, settlement or farmstead. So here we've got a nice example of Leybourne Wood near the little settlement of Leybourne, Kent, with Leybourne Castle nearby. So it shows the sort of ancient history of that area. This is a problematic in some other areas. In Wales, for example, my understanding is, having read Rackham and others, that this doesn't work so well with the range of other information because they tend all to be named after the local farm. So all the other type of place name evidence is really missing. But for England, what I'm about to say works well. It's mainly for England rather than Scotland or Wales. Other types of name evidence for ancient woodland, names derived from an old name for wood. This is a great one, of course. So you've got Grove, Holt, Hurst, and so on. One that always is amusing is a bit like the River Avon, which means river, and so on. Knack Holt Wood means oak, wood. So you've got that issue going on there. And then you've got all the Hursts, Sissinghurst and other names in Kent. So you'll have Sissinghurst Wood, which again means Sissing wood, and so on. So you've got those sorts of issues and interesting things going on in place name evidence. Name for trees, this is another good one, especially indicator trees. Some woodlands will be named for trees, we'll see a little later on, but will often be modern plantations. So the naming after trees in itself is not necessarily indicative unless it tends to be key indicator species. So things like the wild service tree, which is only really found in ancient woodland, also known as the checker tree. So if you come across Chequers Wood, it's likely to be ancient. Willow, lime and holly, so Hollin wood, other derivations of that sort are important. But what gets really interesting, I think, is a good way of engaging kids as well as adults or anyone else, is some of the other weird and wonderful names that suddenly appear on maps. This is one of my favourites. There's, I think, several of these in Kent. Fright Wood, which seems rather obscure, or you might think it's something to do with someone who had an unfortunate experience in that area of woodland. But it comes from frith or thrift, which again itself is from the Old English, which is indicative of perhaps old brushwood or scrub at one time. So it might be very old, but has this old link to perhaps, substandard woodland, perhaps scruffy woodland, rather than the best woodland back in the past. And in the Weald, for example, you have a lot of names associated with the industry in the locality. So again, wherever you move around the country, there might be names of woodlands that are very local. Oh, and sorry, I should have said Fright is a Kent version. It's apparently a sort of Kent dialect for frith. So Frightwood turns up in Kent, but perhaps not so common elsewhere. In the Weald, I use the exercise I work on is the area to the sort of south of Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells. And there are a lot of woods with furnace, forge, hammer in the name. And again, some of you who know the history of that area will see the relevance there to the iron industry and so on. So there's a good way to engage not just geographers, but historians and archaeologists with the importance of this sort of evidence, place name evidence in the landscape. And again, that tends to be indicative of old woods. Other things, recent names, obviously, different here, named after battles, celebrities, and celebrations. So you have Waterloo Woods, Victoria Wood, never thought of it like that before, Jubilee Woods. These tend to be indicative of plantations. But again, you need several of these things. It's not just the place name evidence, but we'll see in a moment, it's topographic evidence, and it's also shape and management structure of these places. Other names associated with woodlands can be related to secondary regrowth. So again, suggestive that they're perhaps not that old. There's a lovely map extract there with Hungary down to the north, but Birch's Rough. So this was probably an area of open, rough land. So again, things like furze or gorse and field or common tend to be suggestive that these are secondary regrowth rather than ancient woodland. But again, evidence on the ground might show differently. There's an example where there are two areas with rough, woodland areas with rough in the title in East Kent, one of which is been acknowledged by Natural England as ancient woodland, and one which hasn't, and that must be based on other evidence. And then things like Spinney as a name, suggestive again of thorny scrub and secondary woodland, though it can be of considerable age. Shape is another thing. So again, you can see how this is a really good way of engaging with students, particularly younger students, with having to look at different types of evidence on the map. So you've looked at name evidence. Now you're starting to get to look at shape and so on. So sinuous and irregular boundary, an absence of straight internal boundaries tends to be suggestive ancient woodland. And as it says there, especially if it follows parish boundaries. And then we have things like the woodbank. We'll return to woodbanks, which tend to be some sort of medieval or perhaps later, but important boundary markings. And things like sinuous streams and natural depressions tend to be indicative of ancient woodlands, probably because they were left wooded when easier to manage land was turned over to pasture and or to arable land. Those steep slopes, again, tend to be old wooded areas, although some of it will be secondary regrowth, particularly again in Kent along the Downs. One area that I use a lot for teaching in the past was secondary regrowth from pasture along the steeper downs. Straight and geometric outlines tend to be indicative of recent planting. So here, very clear example of this is near Wye in Kent, where I used to run field courses. So long plantation, nice straight edges, and lovely straight rides down the middle of that plantation. Wood, of course, a nice bit of beechwood on these steep contours to the east. Shape. Other issues here, consistent with fields and enclosures, this tends to be suggestive of regrowth. So, a couple of fields or more have been allowed to relapse into woodland, whereas ancient woodlands tend to sit awkwardly among surrounding fields. So that's something to look for. But then here, the indication here is about Bournewood, Bourne being the stream, the site's steep slopes along a stream valley, the Bourne itself, or adjacent to things like common land or heath tend to be indicative of woodland, ancient woodland. But again, it's the totality you're looking for. Ticking the boxes on a number of these things is important. And then things like checking the tree symbols, again, a nice easy thing for kids to do, comparing broadleaf symbols with coniferous. If it's nearly all coniferous and there are a lot of straight rides through what's otherwise an irregular woodland, it's likely to be replanted ancient woodland at best. Here's a nice summary diagram, which I used to use with the students. We still have a black and white version on handouts for them, but this one's been made to look a little bit more amusing for the screen. So we've got all of the summary of things going on there. Victoria Plantation, nice straight rides, the name evidence, very much suggestive of not being ancient woodland. Others in the green there, name evidence, Oakwood, very obvious one, Upton Wood with its link to the parish, and a site on a steep slope and a sinuous stream. So we'd use something like this to help students understand, they're given this part of the handout, to understand what they're looking for in summary when they're doing this work. And this is a record sheet showing you the sort of thing they might be asked to fill in. This one hasn't been used. It's a sort of a novel one just put together to start to put a pilot together. But site name and reference. So the student has to choose which woods they're going to decide, or the group. And it's a very good activity for group work. you spread the OS map out on the table, you get 3 or 4 students around it, and they interact really well. So it's a lovely example of something you can do as group work, and better than always working at the screen, because of course having the open ordnance survey map on the table is a much more exciting way of working it than a couple of people crowded around a small screen searching for things. So here you've got Upton Wood, name of local village. East Upton is nearby to the east. Steep valley with streams. So you're ticking up a number of things to suggest that it's ancient woodland, whereas the ones at the bottom with the red crosses are more indicative. So you might have the Pines, which has a tree name, yes, good, but it's isolated in flat land. It's very regular. It's maybe quite small, and it may well be planted for game cover. It might not be ancient woodland at all. So it's that sort of evidence that we'd be asking the students to build up, but using map work as the basis. And what's a really useful resource now, I'm not quite sure how long it's been existing, I'd really check that, but Natural England and DEFRA have this wonderful open data site which you can interrogate. And while their decision on whether something's ancient woodland or semi-natural woodland, in this case ancient semi-natural or secondary ancient woodland, won't be absolutely definitive, it's a good way of checking. So it's another way in which you can engage students and others in doing the field work, coming to their own decisions, and then checking against this official site. So that's very, very useful. And what's also useful about it, it has some other useful information, such as the perimeter, the area, and so on, should a student want to take this further into a piece of research work. Here I'm talking about undergraduates or secondary school children rather than primary, of course. But it's a good site, so if you don't know it, go and have a look if you want to have an investigation of your local area. Right, we're getting there. I won't be too much longer. Ancient woodland and hidden archaeology. Something else which I think is intriguing, and something which again is being seen as important, even down in Key Stage 2, years 5 and 6, is engagement with air photos and other type of imagery. But I've certainly used this with archaeology students at Canterbury Christ Church. I've used it with geographers. I've used it with other people, environmental scientists, comparing information on the maps with other types of evidence. And here's a good example of the idea of not being able to see the woodbank, these various perhaps even medieval structures within woodlands for the trees getting in the way. But as you can see here, Key Stage 2 should be able to, it says here, I can relate maps to each other and to vertical aerial photographs. So they should be able to make those connections even at a relatively young age, coming up for 10, 11 years old. So what sort of things might we get them to look at? Here, Saxonbury Wood. I think that's the same wood. Yeah, that's the same wood we had there as the introductory thing. So here's an old OS map, or somebody will tell me exactly what that scale is. But here you can see very clearly Saxonbury Hill, the camp with a modern tower on it. So you've got the map evidence of an interesting wood with a lot of structures under it, but nothing that can be really seen if we just skip back on that, although of course I've obscured it with the quote. But if we look at the LiDAR imagery that's available for it, so not aerial photography in this case, but LiDAR imagery, type of laser imagery, we can see the structures underneath the canopy. And again, we don't need to go, hopefully, with this audience into the details of how that happens. At the very beginning, I put that image up of looking up through trees towards the sky. And the point is that many of the light points will go not through the canopy, but in the gaps between the canopy. And that's what's used to extrapolate some of these features. But quite clearly, you can see Saxonbury Hill coming up here. And again, you can imagine how using this sort of imagery, perhaps using the National Library of Scotland so that students can compare map to imagery at the same time with the lovely functionality that site has, they can start to pick up other things which aren't even shown on the map. So they find the camp, but suddenly there's a feature, in this case, just to the right of the word wood at the top, which is probably something like an old quarry site. And you can certainly pick up the trackways and other things. So it's a good way for them to engage with and understand the use of some of this sort of imagery. Certainly works really well with archaeology and heritage students that I've worked with. Here's another example. This is a very interesting one. A little bit more writing than I normally put on a slide. Earthworks in Millbays Wood. In the early 20th century, and you can see it there ringed in red, I added that to it, assumed to be part of an Iron Age hill fort. It seems like any embankments in a woodland, locally people would love to be some sort of fortification, a castle of some sort, and so on. It seems that it's much more complex than that, and a lot of hill forts are now being revised, not as defensive, but seen in other ways, other cultural significance. But here, the revision more recently has been the idea that this could be a medieval or post-medieval pond bay. Mill Bay's wood, Mill Pond Bay wood. I mean, it makes some sense, although the evidence from the LiDAR makes me suspect whether that is absolutely true. So we've got the map here, the provisional series 1 to 25,000. Here's the woodland again. You can just maybe see something of the shape in there, but not a lot of evidence. You can't see much on a normal aerial image. But if you go to, in this case, the DSM, where you're still starting to see some of the trees and so on, some of the canopy, I'm not quite sure exactly what's happening. I think the areas where the feature's been exposed, even though it looks like it's under woodland in the previous imagery, is light coppice. So I think it's showing up slightly differently there. I need to check what happened with that particular date of the image. If it had been freshly cut and the other image was of a different date, you might have had fresh regrowth, and therefore that might account for that looking more open. But neither of those things matter too much. It's when you go to the terrain model, and here you can very clearly see the structure. Now, if it is what people are suggesting, that it's a mill pond, then it might have looked something like the image above there. So that's probably a mill associated with a forge, rather than some other type of mill structure. But it doesn't really matter too much. The idea of a pond structure, a dam, and then some sort of industrial activity associated with that. What makes me dubious about that is the fact that if you look at the site itself, you've got, I don't know if my cursor will show up, you've got the bank here, and you've got an area that's been dug out there. That makes some sense, but I would have thought that this ditch that you have on both sides, the ditch on that side wouldn't have survived sedimentation and so on, wouldn't have a clear ditch structure still there. But I may be wrong. I have no expertise in that sort of industrial archaeology. So I think the debate is open as to what that structure is. But it starts to pick up other things that children and students could look for. So what's this here? There's a pond, and then a pit associated with tile and brickworks. So you can start to really pull out what we might think of as the taskscape of the area, not just the landscape, but all the tasks that create a landscape over time. Last couple, I'm going towards the half hour now. It's probably a bit longer than we normally want. Just the last key example here: Broadham Wood and Rookery Wood, which Rookery Wood's not named on the 1 to 50,000, and that's one of the other issues at different scales. Obviously, you have some of the name evidence appears. I tend to work with 1 to 50,000 when I'm doing with students, but that means some of the key names aren't always there. But here you've got a nice screenshot of the National Library of Scotland site, just to show how this would really work well with students. They can look at the maps, they can create their evidence from things like the name evidence and so on, pick out other features, key industries and so on, and then relate it to other types of imagery, which they are expected to do, even, as I say, at Key Stage 2. So here you've got Broadham Wood, but there's no evidence there. What can you see? You can't see any of the evidence of the tile and brickworks, nor of any wood banks or any other types of structures within the wood itself. But if we go to the LiDAR, while it's not as clear, because some of these features are quite small scale features, they're there. You've got the wonderful sinuous stream coming out very clearly, marking one of the edges of Broadham Wood. If I just jump back quickly, you can see that the wood really follows that neatly, and you've got the sinuous edge down here as well. But you're starting to see other things. So in terms of the wood, you've got the wood banks running through the wood, which you wouldn't see. You can't see them along the edge of the wood. So you've got these clear wood banks forming some of the management structures, as well as perhaps the ownership boundary. But you've also got another wood bank running along here, which is suggestive that this area is an area of assart. This is where an area of woodland has been taken into another form of production, generally arable production. But otherwise, there's some other really useful information. Again, go back. There's nothing to be seen around Rookery Wood there. But once you've got the DTM imagery here, you've got the penetration through the gaps in the canopy. You can see all this work that has taken place at some point for the brick and tile works and this big excavation area here. What then makes you wonder is how old some of this woodland is. So this might be relatively secondary woodland if you've had relatively recent workings going on there, whereas some of these other areas may be still ancient woodland. What do we have after this? Oh, that must be the end then. I put that in there. I'm not expecting you to look at that. If anyone wants any of this information, then I can send it on, or Chris can put it up, or however that works.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that. It's a very interesting topic there, and everything that's available. So we'd like to now move on to the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, if they wish to, please put them in the chat, and we'll work our way through them. Yes, I have to say it's very interesting just seeing everything, all the various assets that are available, and how they could actually be combined. To build on a bit of some aspects of the curriculum.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really what I was trying to do with the example. I mean, again, it may or may not everyone's cup of tea to be looking at ancient woodland on maps, but I think there must be an immense amount of stuff out there that could be converted to really contemporary stuff. I mean, next session, I think the Tea Time Talk is Jen talking about our restless earth, in which I think she's using relatively contemporary, not absolutely up to date, but contemporary Japanese maps to look at sort of issues around risk and hazard. And so, I suppose what I'm saying here is, here's a really simple exercise which I've used very effectively for many years with students of different types, but can see how it can be applied to primary or to other areas in education. And, it's just one small exercise which doesn't take too much conversion, I think. I mean, I have to understand, I have to work with the primary people like Paula to make sure that it does fit exactly what's needed by schools. That's the key thing. And we can certainly help people with that. So, as I say, if you're a company, if you're a consultant, if you're a freelancer, and you've got some wonderful materials, maps you've made yourselves that you would be willing, because they're exemplars that you use anyway for publicity, could be used to work with children to get them to understand how to make a really good map. So lessons in map design. That would be superb. So I'm out here trying to get anyone to volunteer.
Yeah, so I'm hopefully we'll get some people that are really, and hopefully get some people that are interested and wanting to put this extra effort into to try and build up this piece of work, because it seems extremely interesting, and it can really, I think it can make a big difference, because a lot of people outside the geo community won't really be seeing this on a regular basis.
Yeah. Shall I try answering a couple of the questions?
Yes. So anyway, so the first question we have is, what's the oldest woodland you've found evidence for?
I don't know. I know that in the Blean, which is one of the largest areas of sort of contiguous woodland in the southeast, which is near to Canterbury, the Blean Woods. I mean, it's difficult because ancient woodland really, and there's one thing I sort of struggle with students getting to understand. It's not the trees. The woodland's not the trees. It's the soil. It's the soil organisms and so on. So the trees are relatively young. They're damn sight older than us in many instances, but they're relatively young. So evidence for the oldest is difficult to say, but you can certainly see some coppice stumps. Coppice is where you cut trees back almost to ground level and they regrow as multiple stems, as poles. And some of the stumps, some of the coppice stools in Kent, could potentially be medieval. So you've got evidence of trees that are still functioning that might be that old, because in fact it renews their lives. I mean, coppicing trees, it revitalizes a tree. I mean, they're essentially sort of new trees that grow up as epicormic growth. So it's difficult to say how old a tree is. Historians like Oliver Rackham, sadly dead now, would be the experts on that. What's the oldest identified one? Sorry, I can't say that, Jim.
No, actually, it adds some of the interesting questions which can be raised in just in looking at this sort of thing. So, okay, we've got one comment which is quite appropriate for this. It's stating it's a real challenge for primary school teachers who are generalists rather than geography teachers.
Yeah. I think this is where it's really exciting to be working with someone like Paula Owens, who is sort of the expert. I think, not the expert, she's one of the experts on map work with schools, even to early years. And she makes the point, and as does Stephen Scoffham, who's a long-term lecturer in primary education that I work with, that you've got excellent teachers out there. They're really good, but some of them may not have done geography or history or maths, whatever it might be they have to teach, since pre-O level, let alone maybe O level or GCSE nowadays. And I get a lady who lives across the road from me. I mean, we haven't had any more of a discussion about this for a few months, but she said, I've just been asked to take over and lead on geography. She said, I hadn't done geography since, again, I think pre-O level. So there is a real struggle, and that's what comes through in Ofsted. It's not that the teachers aren't excellent teachers, it's just they lack some expertise in areas, particularly it's come through in Ofsted for geography, a recent research report, I think it was only just 2021, that there is a real struggle with field work and there's a real struggle with map work. So I think this is somewhere where the BCS, working with people like Paula, working with the OS and working with others, but particularly working directly with primary teachers. I gave a talk, not on this topic, but on sort of map design issues to the early years and primary group of the Geographic Association, their main committee on that the other day. So there's real willingness to engage and they're keen to do more. But yeah, Gillian's quite right. It is a challenge, and it's a challenge for us to understand them as well. That's why having Paula write us. I mean, Paula's written us some really useful guidelines, which I can allow people to have if they want to see how to engage with primary. Equally, we've got what's really good, Alan Parkinson, who is the current president of the Geographic Association, has volunteered to be on our committee as well, and has said he would write up some guidelines for engagement with secondary. I hadn't expected him because he's only just taken over as president, but he's one of those people that, if you want something done, ask someone who's busy. He's an excellent chap. So we've got some good people on our committee working with us.
No, that's good. That is very good to hear that we've got real involvement and interaction with all these groups. So another question, another comment and question. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Given what you said about teachers, are these materials for them a sort of teach the teachers to go along with the map lessons?
Yeah, I think if I understand that correctly, I think what we have to do is provide really useful resources that they can just pick up and run with. One of the things that I did very early on when, because I was asked to chair the committee only last March, and I haven't done as many as I'd like, but we've had some sort of focus groups and meetings with teachers, mainly in primary. It just happens to be because we've got Paula on board, and primary is a really good place to start, funnily enough, because they haven't become too siloed. So many schools will work on a project in which there's history, maths, geography, all linked together. And when I was at the GA, the Geographical Association conference last year, they all talk about history and geography almost in the same breath a lot of the time because it's so clearly mixed, time and space. And the thing there that they mentioned was what they really would like is something like 5 or 6 minute videos that just show them how they could use maps, or how they might use maps that students create to explore place or whatever it will be. So they really need these little snapshots. They don't need a lot of material. They just need a bit of a hand to understand how a resource, maybe digital resources like the National Library of Scotland, could be used. So I don't know, I hope that answers the question there. But yeah, lesson maps, I suppose, or map lessons is something that they just need some hand with. I mean, they're very intelligent people who know how to teach kids, know what they need. And that's the bit we have to learn about as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, thank you very much. Right, okay, another one is one good idea by a local primary teacher was to hold a geography week, bringing in a number of resources, and they attended as a local government officer. They they even managed to entertain the reception class by making a map with toy buildings.
There's a lot of really good experimental stuff to be done. We ought to perhaps get Paula to come and do a talk. I mean, she works in primary schools, getting them to map their school, going out in the yard and creating maps with chalk and so on. There's some really exciting things that are done even with quite early year children. So I think the idea of building, making a map using toy buildings is really exciting. So there is a lot of things going on. Some of those I think you do need the expert in education to sort of help us understand. Others, I think, perhaps as you go up the years, where we can start to supply information. I mean, one of the things I think is really exciting, because, again, I haven't heard anyone not defend the provisional series, but that 1 to 25,000 provisional series is absolutely wonderful. It's out of Crown copyright now. We have a collection at Christchurch, which I've got copies of, not just for Kent, but also where I now live, in around Cirencester, which hope to use scans of to engage students, children with different types of map scale. They're probably, the schools will have more modern ones. They may have Digimap, but there's lots of things I think we can do with the resources that we have to engage them with their locality. I think that's the key thing. Sense of place is another big thing that's coming through in geography and in history. Engagement with sense of place and locality, and therefore community and the future of those places. I did know something about ancient orchards. It was from Rachel. Have you a case study for ancient orchard areas in Somerset? No, but I'm willing to come down if you pay my petrol. We can go and have a look. Yeah. So I can't say yes. But of course, orchards are one of the things that at least, is one of the few land uses that are on OS maps. I mean, we don't map land use on OS maps, but, forestry, woodland, I mean, you may be able to tell them use. It depends whether it's a plantation or whether it's conservation area or whatever. But orchards pretty much stand out for themselves. So they are one of the few land uses that are on there. And I think we've had a couple of students in the past who've done some really good work looking at the changes in orchards in Kent. So their decline, but also their regrowth, but not as old standard trees, but the more modern types of mechanized farming of hard fruits. So there's probably some really good projects that will be done, perhaps a bit higher up the chain, secondary and higher ed on orchards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. We've just had a little. Jim's given us a nice little update on some of the assets that are available, such as the fact that the 1 to 10,000 conventional mapping from the 1970s is starting to become available on the National Library of Scotland.
Oh, good. And all these resources, I mean, it's not just OS, I mean, but that's very important. I mean, there's something called the Vision of Britain site as well that's worth having a look at. And there are a lot of county councils and others that have really good maps. There's a Gloucestershire one which they've put layers onto base maps that show things like all the Roman roads, or they show military history sites and so on. And what's the other one I'm thinking of? Got to get Vision of Britain, that's really good. Oh, yeah, in Kent, they've got something called CLIS, the Kent Landscape Information Service, which has, again, a whole bunch of layers. It's just, accessible. You can get students to look at it. It shows them landscape potential as well as things that already exist, so they can try and sort of tease out and make an estimate of what they would see the habitat potential for landscape will be, and then they can check it against Kent County Council's habitat potential maps and things like that. So yeah, it's great to hear that more information is going up on their NLS, because that's such a wonderful site. So thanks, Jim.
Okay. Well, I have to say thank you very much for all your questions. And so, yes, I want to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. I want to thank Peter again for the talk, and I think there's some real potential for people to get involved and assist in trying to bring this to schools. So next month's talk will be with, as you mentioned, with Jennifer Johnston, where she'll be talking about the British Cartographic Society's Restless Earth programme. So we look forward to seeing you all in the future. But for today, thank you and goodbye.